Hi, it's Steve Toback with OIT Interactive Technology Services. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some sign programming. We had a need come up where we traveled to various shows and events throughout the year, like Tech Expo or Blue Devil Days or the CIT Showcase, where OIT Interactive Technology Services wants to talk about the various services that we provide. We're often limited on table space, however, so when a new event came up, I said, well, why don't we try to use our digital signage application to try to make something that'll fit into a small area, but when somebody wants to talk about something, it'll expand. So I spent about a half a day working on this today. Most of the time actually was spent on making some content or some mock content for this. The programming was fairly straightforward, but it might be helpful for different applications that you might be working on. So essentially what we have here is we have a grid. All of the slides are 1920 by 1080, but sized down automatically by the application. So let's say I'm here at a trade show and somebody wants to talk about the MPS service. I can then just tap on MPS and there's the slides, and then just by swiping I can find a different slide that I want to look for. Here's our locations. And then go back, and did you know that we have a recording studio and we're done. This button only appears when this is active, so I click the button and I head back. So this is the case for any of these applications. I could say, okay, well, let's talk about WebEx, and then when I'm done with that, we can go back here and talk about it. Or let's say do capture. I want to go through my slides, and I could go through and say, well, this is how do capture is used on mobile and various. So you get the idea. So it was a little bit tricky in doing it. My first thought was to use different templates, but in browsing through the software, I found out there's a way you can actually resize regions, which is what I'm doing here. One of the trickiest features was this. Using Sites at Duke, we had a request come up saying, well, why can't we use the actual Sites at Duke? And if you've used the 4Winds software, sometimes it doesn't handle HTML very well. And I'll talk a little bit how I did this, but now when you click on Sites at Duke, and sometimes we're still working on this part, it gets bigger and it makes an actual website. So here's the actual website. I'm actually clicking on it and running it, and people can talk about the parts. But as you know, on 4Winds, you can't overlay buttons, and you can see that button is there. So what I had to do is I shrunk the region. I didn't expand it as much as as the other ones, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then sometimes the back button will work, and there, okay, it did work. So the HTML is working, and it's kind of cool. But let's talk about how I did it. So here we are inside the Content Manager. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the unique characteristics of what I did. And as I mentioned before, my first thought was to make it so that when you click on one of these slides, you go to a different template and then click back. It goes back to the template. But as I mentioned, when I was looking for some documentation, I saw that there's a way to resize your regions on the fly. And you could do some really interesting things with that. And there's also ways you can have the user drag around his region on the fly, which I thought was kind of neat. So that made it a lot easier that I didn't have to have two different templates. I just have this one template here called the event grid, which we'll take a quick look at. There's nothing really big there. What it is a grid of 9 squares. I made them 16 by 9, so they're 640 by 430. And this region 1 up here is where I have my date and time logo, and I have our people pictures just kind of rotating through. And there I used a content feed just pointing at a folder of pictures. With version 4.61 and above, you can do that, and we'll take a quick look at that as well. But that's really all that there is right here. Oh, and there's one other field called the web background, which we'll talk about in a second. So the basic of this is in the region. So here's a region with a bunch, and we'll look at, I did the interactivity inside of the region. So let's take a look at what I did there. So when you look at it, what happens is when you touch the region, you're going to execute this script. And the commands are pretty straightforward. It's region set left to 0 and set top to 0. So what I'm doing is no matter where the region is on the layout, I want to set it up to the top left corner because I'm going to set the width to 1920 by 1080. So that puts the top corner at the top and then makes the whole region 1920 by 1080. Now remember, we had talked that you should always make your content 1920 by 1080, so the content's going to look good when it's big, and of course it'll look good when it's small. So that's these 4 here is, set the region in whatever region you're in. In this case, we're actually in region 3, but so that should be region 3. But it'll run off whatever region you've clicked on, so that doesn't matter so much. And then the next thing here threw me for a little bit of a loop, and this is changing in version 5.0, the setting the Z index. So what that's doing is it's setting it the level. You want to bring it to front. And this number here, so we're saying what region, region 3, the region we're working on, in what order. So this was kind of, as I was developing, was a pain in the neck that every time I added a region, I'd have to increase that number. And I tried messing around making it a variable, but I couldn't make that work. So I had to go into each of the 9 regions and change that. So right now there's 13 elements, and I want to make sure that there's actually 14 elements. I want to make sure that this goes to the top, but not the very top. We want our back button to be at the very top, right? Which brings us to our next thing. So what it does is it plays the back button. Now you can see the back button content over here. That's unscheduled. So when the template plays normally, you don't see the back button. But when I touch it, it resizes the region, it moves the region to the top of the layer order, and then it shows the back button. That's it, really. And I'd like to see if I can get some animation on that if I could. And then I just added the 2 swipes, which are just pretty stock. When you swipe right, advance the content, and when you swipe left, rewind the content. So just showing you within a region, you can have touch and swipe, do different things within the same region. So each of those are done for those. And now let's really take a look at the back button, because there's some different interactivity. So remember, when I click on something, then the back button is activated and is shown. And let's take a look at the interactivity there on the back button. Oops. On here, I actually put it on the content itself. I clicked the wrong thing. Okay, so this looks a little scary, but it's really not. It's just copying and pasting a lot of different things. But what we want to do essentially is we want to restart the template. So what restarting the template does, it gets everything back in order. And then we want to clear out the regions. Now again, there probably was a more elegant way to do this with some sort of variable or math, but what I did is I wrote the first one, clear width, right? We want to clear the width, we want to clear the top location, we want to clear the height, and we want to clear the Z index of where it is. And when you clear it, what happens is it doesn't go to 0, it reverts back to what you've typed in as your normal setting. So whatever you've laid out that region when you've set it up, when you clear it, it goes back to that setting, right? So what I did is I typed the first one, obviously, and then it copy and paste. Once I copied and pasted it, then I copied all of them and went into a simple text editor and then did a find and replace, changed width with top, copied, pasted it in here, changed top to height, copied, pasted it in here, and then did the same thing with the Z index. And actually, I'd forgotten to do Z index. Oh, and you also want to clear the left. So it's top, left, width, and Z index. I'd forgotten to do the Z index, and that kind of messed me up because it would change but then not reset, and things would be on top of other things. So you want to reset everything that you've changed basically in here when you set it. So touching here sets these to heights that are different than its normal height, and then when you click the back button, it resets all of that. And I just have it resetting all the regions. It doesn't matter. And again, I could have done something a little fancier, but this was just easier to do. So the only other kind of fancy thing I want to talk to you about is what I did with the websites. Now, working with HTML and 4.1s can be challenging, and I will click this here, and it's not going to render properly because, remember, it's rendering actual size, right? There can't be a button on top of HTML within the 4.1s application. So for the region that contains HTML, which I believe is region 5, I changed the interactivity a little bit. And what I did here was, rather than setting it to 1920 by 1080, I set it to 1820 by 1080. I reduced the width by 100 pixels. And then to make sure it was centered, I set the left, instead of to 0, 100 pixels from the left. And that just takes it and centers it. And then I play the content, but I also added this other template here called white, and I gave it a web background. So because my region that's activating is not the full width, what was happening was you could see through it. And if we go ahead and I'll go ahead and remove this web background here so you can see it. And now we'll come back here, we'll hit play. So now without that white background, when I hit Sites at Duke, you can see the side. I can see the button, but I also see through it, right? So taking that white and putting it back in there,
So we'll scroll down here. I'll put the web, what I call the web background, which adds this white. And we're going to unschedule it, right? Because we only want it to appear when triggered. And now when I click on sites.duke, you see we get the white background there, and I've got my back button and I can use it. So that was the only little trick that I had to do, just knowing the limitation of Four Winds, that you can't put things on top of HTML. But everything else is pretty standard. So that's it. If you have any questions, have fun programming. Don't forget to just try and have fun. And give us an email at oit-its-info if you have any questions. Thanks.